Hey, this is Miss Rodriguez, and this reading is for the French and Indian War. I'm going to go ahead and read from the online textbook for McGraw-Hill. This is Chapter 3, Lesson Number 1, Rivalry in North America. And here is your assignment. For the directions, it does note that the textbook pages are the ones for the actual paper version of the textbook. I'm just reading from the online textbook to do this video. Question number 1 for the French and Indian War. It is a fill in the blank. In the 1700s, rivalry or competition between blank, also known as England, and blank led to a war for control of North America, and we're going to find the answer on page 92. So we're looking for what two countries went to war in North America. The story begins. Rivalry between Great Britain and France led to a war for control of North America. And there's your answer for number 1. By the mid-1750s, military clashes between the two nations were taking place. As a young officer, George Washington was commanded to enlist men in Virginia and use force to drive the French out of the Ohio River Valley. I'm going to scroll down. In the 1700s, Britain and France were leading European powers. They competed for wealth and empire in different parts of the world. In North America, their rivalry was very strong. Conflict in the Ohio Valley. That's the red heading there. And the next two questions are about the Ohio River Valley. Number 2, what is the Ohio River Valley? How would you describe it? This rivalry turned especially bitter in the mid-1700s. The British began to show interest in the Ohio River Valley. This vast land beyond the Appalachian Mountains was rich in resources. The British believed they had a right to this land. The French also viewed the valley as theirs. So on a map, if you were to take a look at a map here in your textbook, you would see that there is the Ohio River here on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and this area here is the Ohio River Valley. So underneath the Great Lakes, underneath the Ohio River, that's the Ohio River Valley, and it's to the left of the Appalachian Mountains. And number 3, why would the French want to control the Ohio River Valley? The French enjoyed a thriving fur trade with the Native Americans of the region. They did not want to share this business with British settlers. To protect their claims in the valley, the French built a chain of forts from Lake Ontario south to the Ohio River. The British responded by starting to build a fort in what is now western Pennsylvania. Before they could finish, the French seized the site. On it, they built their own fort and called it Fort Duquesne. In the spring of 1754, the governor of Virginia sent a militia, a military force made up of ordinary citizens, to drive out the French. Leading this force was a young Virginian. His name was George Washington. The word militia, by the way, has the same root as the word military meaning related to soldiers or war. But militia is made up of ordinary people. That'll be one of your vocabulary words. After marching to Fort Duquesne, Washington set up a small fort of his own nearby. He called it Fort Necessity. Washington's outpost soon came under attack by the French and their Native American allies. This combined army won the battle and forced Washington's soldiers to surrender. The French later released the soldiers, who returned to Virginia. Number 4. Both the French and the British tried to get Native American help. Why did the French have more Native American allies, meaning supporters, willing to attack the British? And you're looking for two reasons on page 94. Native American alliances. As the conflict got underway, the French and the British both sought Native American help. The French had a big advantage. They already had many Native American allies. Native Americans generally distrusted the British and their hunger for land. In contrast, the French were more interested in fur trading than in claiming land. French trappers and fur traders often married Native American women. French missionaries converted many Native Americans to Catholicism. For these reasons, Native Americans helped the French and raided or attacked British settlements. To counter this threat of the French and their Native American friends, the British colonists tried to make a treaty with the Iroquois. And that takes us to our next question. Number 5, what was the Iroquois Confederacy? They agreed to stay neutral at this time. What does neutral mean? The Iroquois Confederacy was the most powerful group of Native Americans in eastern North America. At that time, the Confederacy included 6 nations: the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Tuscarora. Delegates or representatives from 7 colonies met with Iroquois leaders in Albany, New York in June 1754. The Iroquois refused an alliance or a partnership with the British. They did, however, promise to remain neutral. That is, the Iroquois promised not to take any sides, not to take either side. The Albany delegates also talked about how the colonies might work together more closely against the French. They decided to adopt Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union for a united colonial government. To form a colonial government, each colony would have to give up some of its powers. Not one colonial assembly was willing to do so. The Albany meeting failed to unify the colonists. Meanwhile, the conflict between the British and the French expanded into a full-scale war. The French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, if you were to learn about this in Europe. And their next red heading is the French and Indian War. We're taking a look on the next page. Number 6. Early in the war, what did Native American tribes do on the frontier or the border of the colonies? The French enjoyed early success in the war. They captured several British forts. Meanwhile, their Native American allies carried out raids or attacks on the frontier or the edges of the colonies. They killed colonists, burned farmhouses and crops, and drove many families back towards the coast. And that's your answer for number 6. Number 7. The Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, tried to outspend France in order to win the war. How did Pitt plan on paying for the cost of the war and the soldiers? Next paragraph. The turning point came in 1757 when William Pitt became Prime Minister, the head of the British government. Pitt was a great military planner. He sent more trained British troops to fight in North America. To stop colonial complaints about the cost of war, Pitt decided that Britain would pay for it. He knew that after the war, the British would raise colonist taxes to help pay the large bill. Pitt had only delayed the time when the colonists would have to pay their fair share of the military costs. So eventually, they would raise taxes on the colonists. Pitt's goal was not just to open the Ohio River Valley. He also wanted to conquer French Canada. In 1758, British forces won a key victory in present-day Nova Scotia. The same year, a British force made up mostly of New York and New England militia captured a fort at Lake Ontario. Another British force finally took Fort Duquesne and renamed it Fort Pitt. Quebec, the capital of New France, sat on a cliff above the St. Lawrence River. Because of its position, Quebec was thought to be impossible to attack. In September 1759, British scouts spotted a poorly guarded path along the backside of the cliff. And you see this map shows some of the areas of fighting going towards what's now Canada. At night, Wolfe's soldiers overwhelmed the French guards and scrambled up the path. The British troops then surprised and defeated the French army on a field called the Plains of Abraham. The fall of Quebec and Montreal the next year marked the defeat of France in North America. The war in Europe finally ended with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And we're coming to our next question, number 8. This one is a fill in the blank. So you're going to use the next paragraph to go ahead and fill in these blanks. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, forced France to give blank and most of its lands east of the blank river to Great Britain, also known as England. Britain also received blank from France's ally, blank. Spain got lots of land west of the Mississippi, called Louisiana, as well as the blank of New Orleans. So let's read the paragraph and see what goes in blanks. The war in Europe finally ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. This treaty forced France to give Canada and most of its lands east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. Great Britain also received Florida from France's ally Spain. Spain acquired French lands west of the Mississippi River, called Louisiana, as well as the port of New Orleans. The Treaty of Paris marked the end of France as a power in North America. In its aftermath, North America was in the hands of two European powers, Great Britain and Spain. New British policies. Number 9. After the war, Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley lost their French allies. What happened to Native American trade and their land when the British took control? We'll take a look at those British policies. The French defeat was a blow to Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. They had lost their French allies and their trading partners and now had to deal with the British. The British raised the prices of their goods. Unlike the French, the British refused to pay Native Americans to use their land. Worst of all, more colonists began settling in Native American lands. Many Native Americans saw the settlers as a threat to their way of life. One of these was Pontiac, the chief of the Ottawa village near Detroit. Upset with British policies, Pontiac addressed hundreds of Native Americans from various groups in 1763. My brothers, you see as well as I that we can no longer supply our needs as we have done from our brothers the French. The English sell us goods twice as dear as the French do. When I go to the English commander and ask anything for our sick, he refuses with the reply that he has no use for us. You can well see that they are seeking our ruin. Therefore, my brothers, we must all swear their destruction and wait no longer. Okay, and number 10, what did Chief Pontiac and his followers do? Where did they attack the British colonists? These complaints led to a conflict between Native Americans and the British in the Great Lakes region, called Pontiac's War. The conflict resulted in a number of civilian and military casualties on each side. Pontiac and his forces laid siege to the British fort at Detroit and other British outposts. During Pontiac's War, attacks also occurred along the Pennsylvania and the Virginia frontiers. The same year as Pontiac's War began, Britain's King George declared that colonists were not to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. To enforce this new rule, the British planned to keep 10,000 troops or soldiers in America. The Proclamation of 1763 helped remove a source of conflict with the Native Americans. It also kept the colonists on the coast where the British could control them better. Number 11, in 1763, what did King George announce or proclaim? In the same year as Pontiac's War began, I just read that one. The same year as Pontiac's War began, Britain's King George declared that colonists were not to settle west of the Appalachian Mountain, and this is called the Proclamation of 1763. How did King George enforce the proclamation? Number 12. To enforce this new rule, the British planned to keep 10,000 soldiers or troops in America. And number 13, last question. Why were the colonists upset by the proclamation of 1763? Colonists believed that the proclamation limited their freedom of movement. They feared that the large number of British soldiers might interfere with their liberties or their freedoms. As a result, distrust began to grow between Britain and its American colonies. Britain's financial problems also led to trouble. Deeply in debt as a result of the war with France, the British government made plans to tax the colonies and tighten trade rules. These efforts would lead to a conflict and eventually the American Revolution. And then it says, for your reference, you're going to need to be able to identify these places on a map for your future quizzes and to understand the lessons better. On the map, we want you to be able to see where the Mississippi River is. It goes from north to south. It's a huge river in the United States. We want you to find the Ohio River. So you could see the Ohio River Valley, the area on the left of the Appalachian Mountains and under the Ohio River where there was a lot of fighting that happened between the French and the English. And then the last thing is the Proclamation Line of 1763. That's a natural border for the colonies because it's the Appalachian Mountains. So colonists were forbidden from moving past the mountains, but many colonists moved into the Ohio River Valley anyway. They were building their houses there, etc. And so the soldiers would go and they would clear colonists out of the Ohio River Valley, clear them out of the Appalachian Mountains, and tell them to move back towards the coast. So that's this red line right here, the line that colonists were not supposed to cross in order to avoid fighting with Native Americans like Chief Pontiac.